Good afternoon or evening, depending on what side of the pond you're on, and welcome to Across the Pitch. My name is Phil Kennedy, and I'm here with Jonny Hibberd to talk about our Team of the Month, Stevenage. If you don't know much about Stevenage, well, I'm right here with you because we're the show for people who think that Ben Nugent sang Cat Scratch Fever.
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon. Good evening. Kind of reminds me, we used to have a player called Dean Martin. So I always drop that one in about around Christmas time. Strange one, actually. He used to play for us on loan from a team in Iceland. So he literally used to play the entire year. Said that his hobby was running marathons and was known for a couple of long-range, like halfway line goals. So it's Dean Martin for you.
Well, that sounds like an interesting character. And just to fill in our listeners, of course, Ted Nugent would be the one that said Cat Scratch Fever, among other things. Ben Nugent is a 26-year-old defender. Looks like he started 23 matches for Stevenage this year, so he's a pretty solid fixture in your backfield, isn't he?
Yeah, and he was, like a lot of these players, he was very, very good last season. His father actually played for the club, played as a goalkeeper. So there were family ties there. He came in last season as a trialist initially, did really well. But this season, like a lot of the others, just kind of hasn't clicked as well. But he did score a freak long-range goal in the tour in Jersey, which we enjoyed. I think he looked more shocked than we did.
Just to give you a little bit of background, since you're new to the show here the past few months, when we first started the show, one of the big things that we used to joke about is just like things that Americans would confuse about, like soccer terminology or names of teams, and think that they were something else from pop culture, and then we would kind of use that as a way of introducing what that actually is.
I'm sure that works the other way as well.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually what kind of surprised me, and that was what we were talking about, I think, a few weeks ago, and I said one of the things that I was surprised with it was how often I ended up having to explain how the MLS worked to other people, things like that. And then, in terms especially of soccer or football, whatever you prefer to call it, that United States is definitely the oddball.
Wasn't there a player I think an English player who signed for an MLS team and said that he wanted to keep the team safe from relegation or something? I don't remember who it was. So if even the players are confused, then you can't blame the supporters.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing about it is if you come over from another country and, you played in 3 or 4 different leagues and they all had relegation, you just got to kind of, assume that that's the way things work. And, with the... one of the first things, like I said, one of the first questions I ever asked when I started watching the Premier League is, I was like, so when the season ends, whoever has the most points is the champion, that's it? There's no tournament after that? That just blew my mind.
Yeah, but I often wonder, because with the MLS, you've got the Supporters' Shield, haven't you?
Yes.
And I've often wondered, because that's the regular season, I don't know, the best record in regular season. I often wonder if there's a sort of militant group in America that kind of refuses to watch the playoffs at the end and considers the Supporters' Shield team the champions.
I would think that anybody that has that belief system probably just wouldn't watch the MLS altogether. I mean... I think that the way that I look at it is in the National Hockey League, they have what's called the President's Trophy, and the President's Trophy is for whatever team has the most points in the regular season, where obviously the Stanley Cup goes to the champion of the playoffs. And to me, I look at the Supporters' Shield of the MLS kind of like the President's Trophy at the NHL, where, yeah, sure, it's a nice thing to win, but it's not the trophy that you're after.
Yeah, I mean, I'd quite like to think, because I think these days in England that the FA Cup gets a really raw deal. And in a way, although it's obviously a completely separate competition, it would be nice if the FA Cup these days maybe give it the fourth Champions League spot, give it a bit more prestige, and that it would be our equivalent of having the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the overwhelming thing is that the EFL Cup really just isn't necessary. But at the end of the day, the EFL isn't going to give that up because they want that money coming in. So that ends up taking away from the FA Cup, which to me is the true competition. Where we're over here in the US, we have what's called the US Open Cup, which is our version.
Yeah, I follow it.
Of the FA Cup. And it's unfortunate to me over here is that since the MLS has come in, that it's kind of taken something away from that tournament. Where I like looking back to like the 1960s and seeing that I think there's like a team called like the Philadelphia Greek Americans or something like that won 4 times. And to me, that's a lot more interesting than seeing LA Galaxy.
Definitely. And those are the teams that kept it going. Every year there was a name on the trophy. So, yeah, I can kind of I think I'm with you there. Yeah.
That's why I'm kind of partial to the Richmond Kickers in USL League One, is because they're that one team that's still around that kind of had that history before the MLS.
Yeah, I mean, I've often done like the thought experiment of, if the MLS model were just to collapse overnight, which teams would actually survive on their fan bases and things? And you've probably got about 5 teams, really, haven't you? Teams like Seattle and Portland are the ones I'd be thinking of.
Well, I mean, Seattle and Portland, I think both of the Los Angeles teams, I think Atlanta United.
Yeah, but I mean, Portland, they've got the history that goes back before the MLS, haven't they? So the name wasn't new and so on.
Well, yeah, the history. I'm just talking about in terms of the fan base. I mean, I would have to think that LA Galaxy would probably survive. I would think that LAFC would probably survive. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, even like NYCFC, they're owned by Man City's ownership group. I mean, there's enough money in the league that I think that most of the teams would probably survive, even if the governing body itself went away. I mean, to me, the MLS kind of holds some of these teams back. I think that basically what you would have if the MLS went away is you would have something that would end up more like a European system, where you would see your LA Galaxies and your NYCFCs be able to outspend everybody else, and then you would end up with like something that would look a lot more like Bundesliga, where there would be 4 teams would have all the players, and then there would be the also-rans.
Yeah, which of course is what happened with is it Cosmos or Cosmos? I'm never quite sure.
The New York Cosmos, they have a lot of history, and see, they're basically kind of a team without a league right now, and of course they're very anti-MLS, and they'll never be part of the MLS. And because of that, they can also never be part of the USL, because the USL has ties to the MLS. So then they kind of keep bouncing around to different organizations that keep going out of business. And, it's like basically they have the funding and the history, but it's like, it's a bad situation for them. So, I mean, certainly if the MLS were to go away, then, maybe they could step into whatever the after of the MLS was. But realistically, the MLS isn't going anywhere. There's just too much money put into it collectively already.
Yeah. So I think one of the terms that would probably confuse US fans when they started to dig kind of deep into the football pyramid in England is the use of the word conference, right? So back until I don't remember when they changed it from the conference to the National League, but back in the mid-90s when I started following Stevenage, of course, the conference was called the GM Vauxhall Conference, and that's a bit misleading for US fans because it wasn't regionalized. It was, another kind of national level division. So I'm going to kind of
things where, at the time that I started following, it was already called the National League, but I've come to know that it's called the conference, that the conference and the National League are one and the same. So yes, anytime you hear somebody say the conference, that's actually referring to what's now
what it means.
National League. Yeah.
It's good shorthand. And to be honest, some of these names for leagues are a bit naff, to be honest. Like the worst one for me is the Championship. Yeah, I think it's really, really the stupidest name for a league ever.
It's confusing because it makes you think that it's like the top tier. Like it should be League 1, League 2, and League 3.
Probably, yeah. And to be honest, I mean, I sort of end up boycotting these names altogether and just talking about, the second tier, the third tier, or something like that. But obviously, because we've been playing in League 1, League 2, I think that kind of sticks now.
I guess that the way that it works, though, is since the Premier League is technically separate from the EFL, then the Championship is the championship of the EFL.
Yeah, I don't buy into that. Really.
I mean, the USL basically copied the same format where now we have the USL Championship, USL League 1, USL League 2, and it's just such a mouthful to say championship. I think it is part of that. The problem, it just it doesn't really roll off the tongue like Premiership does, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, at the end of the day, the Premier League's the Premier League, and you're never going to rival that. So I want to kind of go back to the mid-90s. Okay, so I had actually just come back home. My parents had sent me to boarding school for a few years up in the Midlands, which is where I get a slightly kind of northern edge to my southern accent, which just kind of confuses people because people from the north think I'm definitely from the south, and people from the south think I'm definitely from the north. So there you go.
I would have guessed the Midlands if I heard you talk the first time. I would have guessed the Midlands. Like I would have guessed somewhere like kind of Eastern Midlands. I guess kind of where you live now. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of. Well, we're moving soon. Actually, we're going to London, but that's another story. So, even like in the kind of, you have to imagine, or perhaps perhaps you remember that back in those days, of course, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have computers at home and stuff like that. So how were we finding out about football? It was things like looking at the back of newspapers, and you just started to notice in the mid-90s that Stevenage had moved from the very, very small print in the bottom of the paper to slightly larger print higher up the result as they were climbing the pyramid. So I was sort of aware of them at the back of my mind. And then I think it was my uncle that gave me the push to actually go to a Stevenage game because they had drawn Staines in the FA Cup second qualifying round. Because, back in the day, we had these epic journeys. So, for example, when we played Newcastle, I think we started in the first qualifying round, went all the way to the fourth round, so that's quite an epic journey. I went with them to a second qualifying round against Staines Town, but Stevenage won 2-0, and I just kind of warmed to it and then started going to more and more games. They won the league that year, But the game I'm going to talk about is from the following.
One thing I wanted to kind of build on what you're saying there, and I'm certainly going to date myself here a bit, but yeah, I mean, from back in those days, I mean, if something wasn't televised, and back then, I mean, even if you had cable, that was maybe one or two extra sports channels. So, I mean, they weren't going to be televising something, and unless, maybe it happened to get on local TV or something. So these teams for you were literally nothing more than, like you said, maybe small lines on the back page of the sports section. And then, at that point, sometimes you might follow a team for a couple of years, and then you finally attend that first game, and it's just like it brings all of those lines of the newspaper that you're reading to life. And the story that I wanted to tell, though, and I'm sure you'll be able to relate to this, is I remember when I was a kid, probably when I was, 10 years old or so, before the internet came out. And then, so like if a game started, say, 8 or 9 p.m. my time, and I ended up falling asleep before the game went over, sometimes I would, have to wake up. And if the game finished whenever was after the deadline for the newspaper to come out, I would have to wait until the following day's newspaper came out just to know who won.
Yeah, it's mad. So
I mean, I remember the first time, and I would say this is probably about 1995 or 1996. I went over to my friend's house at this NBA game. I had just finished watching this NBA game, and I went over to my friend's house, and he had ESPN, which is a sports channel over here, ESPN.com, pulled up on his computer. And I had, never really seen the internet before. This was like 1995. I walk in, and he has ESPN.com up with the score to the game I had just finished watching. And I was just blown away. I'm like, how do they already have that game just got over? I couldn't compute how it was even possible. And this was only 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, even I think it was 15 years ago, I was, because I spent several years living out in Eastern Europe, and that kind of is part of the excuse for me getting into the Belarus League. And Stevenage were playing in a playoff final against Carlisle United. And I had agreed to go on a hiking trip to Transylvania in Romania. And so all I had was a very primitive mobile phone with me. And I asked my brother to text me every time there was a goal. And on the night of the game, I was just pacing around this village. I mean, this is a village where the cows in the evening walk home independently. Or, for example, I was out there, we were doing concerts in the evening, and we invited one guy to come to our concert in this Romanian village. He said he'd love to come to the concert, but he had to wait for his goat to come home. So if you can imagine, I'm in this place wondering what the hell is going on between Stevenage Borough and Carlisle United in the playoff final. And I get one text from my brother saying that Carlisle had taken the lead. And I heard nothing else at all. So I didn't know if we'd equalised. I didn't know if that was the final score. And similar thing, I think I had to wait like 2 days before we crossed the border back into Hungary to find out that we had indeed lost 1-0.
Wow. It's funny to think that, none of this was all of that long ago. And now, it's like, we get upset if we're in a bad service area and can't stream a live match on our phone,
Yeah. So, so I started watching.
So we've digressed a lot, but let me let you get back to your stories here.
Yeah. So we get to 95-96 season, Stevenage win the league. And I talked last week about how, it was the third in a line of three kind of great betrayals of non-league football. And it was to do with the Football League making more stringent stadium regulations. And anyone who follows non-league football, in England will tell you that these kind of rules are a plague and they run right down the pyramid. So you've got, at very low levels, you've got quite an absurd situation where to go up, you need, 20 more seats. So basically a lorry arrives with some kind of a temporary construction with 20 plastic seats on it and puts it in the stadium. No one ever sits in these seats, but they allow that team to get promoted. It's madness, but there you go.
Well, I think we were talking about a possible situation with Harrogate on Twitter the other day.
That's right, yeah. The fact they've got an artificial pitch and artificial pitches aren't allowed in the Football League. So I'm obviously biased in this, but I think, obviously if Stevenage stay up now, they've, after only 3 wins this year, that's obviously, the best deal you can imagine. But equally, Harrogate, in one of only 6 playoff spots, getting promoted on points per game. Well, if they go up, I think they've got the, deal of the century, to be honest. But yes, we're talking about these ground regulations. So 2 years before, we won the conference, Kidderminster Harriers won the conference, weren't allowed up because of ground regulations. They just needed a bit of time to make the improvements. I think they worked out they would have had to play probably 2 home games at West Brom, and that's it. I don't see how that would have been a massive hardship for the Football League. But so they weren't allowed up. The following year, Macclesfield Town won the conference. Macclesfield Town got backing from a local businessman who later shot himself. So there's lots of intrigues there.
I didn't hear about that. I'll have to look that story up.
Yeah, you really need to make Macclesfield your team of the month, probably. Then they'll probably tell you more. They were not allowed up because of ground regulations. What was really, really absurd about that is that about 3-4 years earlier, Chester City's old stadium had burned down and they needed somewhere to play. And Macclesfield is in the same county in Cheshire. So they had already played Football League games at Macclesfield's ground. So to then turn around 2 years later and say Macclesfield couldn't stage Football League games there, it was obviously ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems kind of fishy to me.
Yeah. And then when Stevenage won the league, I mentioned this story about Torquay fans cheering every week when Stevenage won.
We started that the other week, but we didn't get to that. So I was hoping we would come back to this story.
Yeah. So I think the old regulations said that you needed to have your stadium ready for the following season by, February, March or something. Well, to be honest, a lot of teams don't know that they're going to be challenging for the title that early on. So to plan for that. So again, that was...
Plus, how do you do construction on the stadium while the season's in play?
Well, I suppose you could, but I don't think they really...
Well, I'm saying like in Harrogate's case, how would you replace a pitch mid-season? It's not something you could do in a 1-week period between matches.
Well, the rules have changed, you see. And now, basically, you've got some time after the league finishes to make the improvements. And the reason that the rules changed is thanks to Stevenage, because Stevenage chairman at that time, Victor Green, was absolutely livid that we weren't going up. And when he was interviewed when we finally won the league, saying it, and journalists were saying to him, "Oh, you must be gutted that you're not going up." And he said, "Who says we're not going up?" And he launched legal action. He launched legal action against the Football League. He launched legal action against Torquay United, which, was a bit of a mad pursuit. And that was an awkward family thing because my uncle is married to a girl from Devon. And we went down to stay with them. And it turned out that they're a family of Torquay United fans.
Could have been an Exeter house.
Yeah, so I remember her father in his broad Devonshire accent saying, "Oh, we've done nothing wrong apart from coming bottom of the league." And I had to kind of fess up that I'm a Stevenage fan, and there was a Stevenage shirt on the guest bed in his house. So there you go. But yeah, Stevenage kicked up a stink, and after that, the deadline for making changes was shifted. So it's been, there hasn't been another case of a team not being promoted since that time. So yeah, so if there's now an insistence that two teams go up from the conference this season, we kind of also, because we put a lot into the campaign for 2 up, 2 down, because it used to be only one team going up and one team coming down. And I actually myself went to a demonstration to protest in favour of that. So you feel like if they bump up 2 teams from the conference this year just to relegate Stevenage, we're kind of being hoisted by our own petard a little bit. But what I did say,
stuff like that always seems to come back.
Yeah, it's like, the Hungarians were occupied by the Turks, right? And part of the reason for that is that 150 years earlier, Hungarians had sold gunpowder to the Turks to break the Constantinople. So yeah, it's something a bit like that.
Yeah, other cases, but I won't go into that.
Yeah, so peak digression there. But yeah, what I did say last week as well was how good it was for the quality of the football, that the bottom division was really becoming a bit of a tired league. So if you imagine a league with 2/3 of the teams really poor footballing sides and no relegation, not really a very attractive product. And at the top of the conference, yeah, it was a very, very different story. So if I get into the following season after we won the league, in that season, we had our first ever victory against a Football League club. We beat Leyton Orient away. In fact, we scored a goal after 54 seconds against Peter Shilton, who was the England goalkeeper at Italia 90. So we went on to play Birmingham City in the 3rd round. And at that time, they were very worried about non-league stadiums hosting big games. So they used to more or less coerce or kind of force the non-league team to switch the game. So we played at Birmingham as the home team, as it were. And the reason I'm mentioning it is, I don't know if you know old Alan Hansen, the old Liverpool defender. He used to be a regular on Match of the Day. And he said after watching that game that for the first half an hour, he couldn't tell the difference between what was the championship side and what was the non-league side. So the quality of the football being played by the conference team was that impressive that it was kind of making an impression.
I've seen that a few times in the FA Cup recently, I have got to say. But I think that the difference is that back then the upper level teams, I think, would generally play their best sides. I think a lot of times you see the Premier League and even the Championship teams maybe not playing their best sides in the FA Cup these days.
Yeah, but I'll tell you another interesting difference is that at that time there was a very, very strict separation between the teams that were full-time and the teams that were part-time. So if you were 3rd division, you were full-time. If you were in the conference, you were part-time. And for example, when Macclesfield got promoted, players had to make a decision about whether they were going to become full-time footballers or not, and some chose not to and to just join another non-league club. So these were semi-professional players, whereas now,
there's still at least, I think, 1 or 2 teams in the conference that aren't full-time. I don't think Chorley is full-time.
No, and you may well find, I don't know off the top of my head, but you may well find teams like Maidenhead are still part-time. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixture, but it becomes very difficult once the first few teams went full-time. you were like, well, we're not going to compete unless we follow suit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the teams that aren't full-time are generally towards the bottom of the table.
Yeah. So in that Birmingham game, in fact, Barry Hales, I mentioned him last week. Barry Hales was hyped as the Ian Wright of the Vauxhall Conference. Paul Fairclough, basically the manager back then, had built up a side over several years that had gone up the leagues. When a team gets momentum, quite often, they don't hang around in leagues in the pyramid. They just keep going. They had gone through the Isthmian Premier League with a high points total. In the conference, they won it in their second season. And when you look back 2-3 seasons earlier, you've got a lot of the key players there already. So Des Gallagher, the goalkeeper, you've got people like Mark Smith, the defender, and Paul Fairclough did some interesting things. I believe Mark Smith was a striker that Fairclough turned into a defender, and I believe Barry Hales was the opposite case, who was a defender who was switched to being a forward. So, and the amazing thing about Barry Hales is he's 48 and he's still playing football.
Wow.
Yeah, it's worth checking his Wikipedia profile. I mean, after his professional.
So now you mentioned the Isthmian Premier League in there. That's like 9th tier, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's like a 5-tier jump from there to the conference. That's why it caught my attention.
But it's changed. It's changed. So back then, it was the league below the conference.
Oh, okay.
Because there was no conference north and south. That came later. So, so Barry Hales, he's played 11 times this season for Mersham and scored 1 goal. He puts it down to apparently when he was at Fulham and he played with Jean Tigana. And Jean Tigana was very keen on players looking after themselves and eating the right things. And basically, he swears by the advice he was given then and has kept it going. There's a lot of footballers, once they retire, they just kind of let themselves go and live in the pub. But, you don't have to. It just shows.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's guys that get into coaching and announcing and, things like that. But there's only so many of those jobs to go around. And I think it's one of those things where, guys, especially in England, they're starting their football career sometimes at, 8 years old. And then, you do the same thing from 8 until 35 or whenever you have to retire. It's really hard to just, kind of start a brand new career at that point in life. And certainly, you're playing in the 3rd or the 4th division, you probably haven't accumulated enough money to retire by 35.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be said that all of those people became pub landlords, but, the number of pubs has shrunk a lot since those days. So I'm not sure that works anymore. So the game I picked out specifically was a kind of battle royale of that time. And I've been a bit brave. I decided, I could say classic games where you could choose the same ones that everyone else would choose. You could just choose all the wins, And I decided actually, what? Some of my big memories are not necessarily wins. So the game was on 29th of March 1997. Stevenage Borough 2, Macclesfield Town 3. And it was played in front of a crowd of almost 6,000. Okay? Now,
That's
even
a nice
though...
crowd.
Absolutely. And even though we've been in the Football League, we've been in League 2, we've been in League 1, we've got teams coming to us sometimes with, if you think we were playing Wolves, Sheffield Wednesday, Sheffield United in League 1, the teams that brought big away followings. But I struggle to think of the last league game that we got 6,000 people for. So there really was a kind of football fever around the conference and around Stevenage in the mid-90s. When you went to Stevenage games, there was an announcer with a really characteristic voice. I forget his name now, but he worked for BBC Radio 3, which is the classical music station. So he had this rather smooth kind of classical DJ kind of vibe.
Everything from Mozart to Messi.
Well, a bit later on, I don't know what it was, and I should know because I'm a classical musician on the side. But he used to play singer actually. So I sing. It's choral music, so it's a bit different to going to football. And it sometimes means at matches I have to kind of worry about my voice slightly if I know I've got to sing the next day. But, a goal's a goal. Fortunately, this season, we scored so few of them that conflict didn't really come up.
They're like, your voice has been better than ever this year.
Yeah, exactly. I think the choir director has basically been bribing the club. But, yeah. So basically, in those days, I mentioned Barry Howe's Efitoba Soji, who one of the things he was famous for was wearing variously, you might call it a bandana or a tea cloth around his head. And the reason he wore this is apparently his mother in Nigeria said that he should wear it to ward off evil spirits. So I don't know if that worked, but I do know he was, a very, very good player in that team. I think any team that won the conference.
Maybe the whole squad needs to wear those.
Yeah. Well, any team that won the conference at that time probably had at least 2 or 3 players who were too good for that league. And you can argue about who the others were. I mean, we had Dave Venables in midfield, who was very good. Mark Smith, when we played Newcastle a couple of years later, claimed to have Alan Shearer in his pocket. But he's famous. The first goal that Alan Shearer scored against us at St James's Park, Mark Smith basically did a bicycle kick clearance off the line. And of course, in those days, there was no goal line technology. So it's in kind of borough folklore that the ball never crossed the line. And there were spectacular kind of pictures in the newspapers the next day. But so we go 2-0 up in that game. I think we were, Macclesfield were top after Kidderminster had made the early running that year. So all of 3 of those teams that had been denied promotion were really kind of in the mix that season. And if we had been able to win that game, we would have very much clawed our way into championship contention. So we were 2-0 up. Midway through the second half, Macclesfield get a player sent off. So you think, well, that's all over. And then Macclesfield hauled their way back into it, a scrappy goal followed by a penalty. And I suppose the biggest surprise, because often when a team has a free kick at that level, often the result is not very good at all. But sadly for us on that day, Macclesfield pulled out a brilliant free kick. And you walked away shaking your head saying, well, it was gutting, but it was a really, really epic game, and just shows you what things were like. And I don't think, we've had success since then. We've had fantastic times, but it's been very different. And if you think that the average attendance that season was almost 3,000, and within 2, 3, 4 years, the attendances had dropped right back down.
Do you think that goes back to kind of what I was talking about earlier? And you're saying that was in the late 90s where, how I was talking about earlier, that there just wasn't as many sports on TV back then, so you kind of had to go out. And now that there's just such the proliferation of sports that it's hurt attendance at the local grounds.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that. And obviously, we have the 3 p.m. rule that you're not allowed to broadcast games at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. But to be honest, if there's a 5:15 p.m. Premier League kickoff, unless you're going to watch it, in the clubhouse at the stadium you're going to, then you'll decide and you'll watch one game, won't you? So yeah, it has changed a lot. But and
there's so many there's just so many options now. Like, if somebody wanted to go out and stream a game from another country, it's not that hard to do.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, it was a kind of kind of peak of the conference, really, that I don't think it ever quite got back to. It changed in some good ways. I mean, a lot of league clubs started getting relegated. And the only reason I say that's good is because when we couldn't get promoted, the kind of silver lining for me was, well, perhaps we don't need to get into the Football League, because in the conference, the Football League comes to you. You know, once we were playing big teams like Oxford and Luton, you were thinking,
right.
Bad in itself, you know. But you know,
clubs in there right now. I mean, Notts County's in there. I mean, there's some big clubs in there now.
Yeah, I mean, Wrexham, Stockport. I mean, I saw Stockport in the second tier against Portsmouth, you know, not that many years ago. And they've really been through the wars since then. So the second game I want to talk about, and I promised that I would tell you last week who we hate. Yeah, so this is a really strange one. I mean, perhaps it would be more a sort of US distance for a derby, this. So the team that we most hate, the team everyone talks about, is 53 miles away from Stevenage. Around, I don't know if you know the M25, which is the kind of orbital motorway around London.
I've heard of it. I mean, I'm sure that most of our listeners are probably familiar.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be known as England's biggest traffic jam, or England's biggest parking lot, you know. But yeah, so I'm going back to Monday, the 12th of April. Yeah, we used to play midweek games on a Monday night. I'm not entirely sure why that was, but yeah, Monday nights at Broadway was a bit special. So Monday, 12th of April, 1999, and we were definitely partying because it was Stevenage Borough 5, Woking 0. Okay. Now, Woking is, as I said, you drive around the M25. It's, you pointed out last week, Stevenage is just kind of to the north of London, and Woking is to the southwest of London. So I've tried to pin down, nobody really knows where this rivalry came from, but they apparently still sing a song about how much they hate us. The only thing I'll give them is that they still mention the proper name Stevenage Borough in the song. So it's kind of depressing to me that our, fiercest rivals still get it right. But yeah, I tried to figure it out, and I suppose it's because, you know, often you just get that where teams had a certain time in their history where they had epic battles against each other. So I think that's where the Man United Leeds thing comes from, or, you know, some other things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have an article here, and it does mention that game here in one of the six that are mentioned in this article. So, I mean, you're certainly not alone.
Yeah, so, there were some, as I say, some epic battles. The FA Trophy was a much coveted trophy for a long time for us because Woking were able to win it 3 times, and it took a long time for us to notch our first win. Eventually, we won 2 FA trophies and 2 conference championships against their 3 FA trophies, so I think we win. But there was a famous semi-final. The FA Trophy semi-finals still played over 2 legs, right? And back in 96, I think it was, we were heading out of the FA Trophy until the final minute when we equalised on aggregate. But rather than play extra time and penalties on that day, they played a one-off replay at Watford's Vicarage Road Stadium, which Woking sneaked 2-1. So, yeah, there were some really, really epic battles. Woking used to be managed by a guy called Jeff Chappell. Now, years and years later, I ended up working for the British Council when I was out in Ukraine. And one of my colleagues was a former youth player at Kingstonian FC who had a terrible grudge against Jeff Chappell and the way that Jeff Chappell had mismanaged his football career. So who knows if that's fair or not. But The thing about Jeff Chappell is he seemed to be very, very good at cup football. So Woking had famous cup games against like Coventry City, teams like that. And he seemed to be able to get in players who were basically league players, professional players, but in the twilight of their careers. And it was almost like he was saying to them, if you come to us, you can have a slightly easier life. And he just got them up for those big games. So it tended to mean if you had a big game in the league or a big game in the cup, they just had a bit of quality kind of hidden away. But other weeks they'd be very ordinary. So
what I was just thinking is we could also be the show for people who think walking is an Asian buffet restaurant.
Yeah, well, the thing about Woking is it's quite a wealthy place. If you fly over that part of Surrey, there's a lot of stockbrokers, those kinds of people that live out there. And so if you fly over that area, there's all swimming pools in the garden and stuff like that. Whereas Stevenage, by the standards of the south of England, it's kind of relatively deprived, actually. So the town centre these days is a bit run down, sadly. So I think maybe there was a sort of social divide between the clubs. There was a real sort of cultural difference between their supporters and ours, which kind of bred a bit more hatred. I don't know. So, a lot of fair weather Stevenage fans. And, I'm really in two minds when local people say to me, the best time of, Stevenage Borough was playing Newcastle. Well, in a way, that's true. But in another way, you know what? There were sort of 8,000 people there for that game. And how many of those people went to the following league game? Not very many, right? So you tended to think that, the hero of that cup run was a guy called Giuliano Grazioli, who is a Londoner, okay?
In Phoenix, we have a version of those people, and those are the people who say haven't watched the Phoenix Suns since 1993. People in Phoenix, I get that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit like when we've had those big occasions, the big FA Trophy finals and things, and they were fantastic. But at the same time, I feel frustrated at those games because you can't get any of the songs going because none of the people sitting around you know any of them. It's just kind of, so for those, to me, those aren't necessarily my favourite occasions. So Grazioli was the hero of that cup run, but not necessarily my hero because he was previously on loan at Woking and scored against us in some key games, and I hadn't quite forgiven him by the time that came around. That particular season, the 98-99 season, was a really, really strange one. For some reason, Victor Green decided in the autumn of 1998 to sack Paul Fairclough after several years at the club and after gaining several promotions. And I don't think anyone's got a satisfactory explanation for why that was. We had just lost 4-1 to Lincoln City in the FA Cup, but Lincoln City were a league football team at that time, and we were a non-league team. So that seemed a strange thing. There were rumours that the chairman had got annoyed with Fairclough's insistence on trying to use unorthodox methods to get more out of the team. An earlier example of that was when he got ballet dancers in to do ballet exercises with the players to improve their balance. And we ended up on...
I think that's the type of thing that has to be something where the player wants to do it for it to work for that guy. I think that when you take something like that and force it upon a whole team, it's rarely going to end well.
Yeah, well, they seemed to take to it. When they scored against Hereford United in the Cup, they did a ballet dance celebration for the goal. So, that's gone down in the kind of annals of history. But apparently at that time, he was saying, I want to get sports psychologists in and at the level that we were playing. And I kind of hinted that, as that season drawed to a close, the chairman suddenly said that the club was in a lot of financial trouble. So, so what can I say? Really, the main thing I remember about that game is that we won 5-0. Very, very good goals, very, very nice goals. We had a guy at that time called Carl Alford, who I think probably could have played at a higher level, but his waistline kind of suggested that he didn't want to. So we spent like the last half an hour of the game, because we'd beaten Woking previously that season as well. Spent the last half an hour singing "The double over Woking is better than winning the league," and it still comes out occasionally. So again, crowds are already dropping at that time. 2,028 of us were lucky enough to witness that. But I think if people ask you what would be the silver lining of dropping into the conference next season, I think it would definitely be renewing hostilities with the old enemy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking through here at some of the articles that I pulled up before we talked today, and it definitely seems like, that was the rivalry, especially in the late 90s, like he said. And then I'm looking through here, and I see that, so there's 2 FA Trophy finals that you were mentioning are in 2007 and 2009, and
I'll probably just talk about one more at the moment.
Yeah, let's do one more for today, and then we'll just pick up next week, because we've digressed a lot, and I know that's my fault, but that's part of the fun of it, is it's kind of chatting a bit. But let's do one more, and then we'll just kind of pick up next week, because this is great stuff, and I just love hearing your stories, and like you said, when you're at certain games, there's 6,000 people there, and you know that the next game those people maybe aren't all going to be there, but then when you're there at the match with 2,000, these are the 2,000 people that are here every week. I get to celebrate this moment with them, and it makes it a little bit more special.
Yeah, it kind of means more to me. So there was a long quest to get to an FA Trophy final, and we finally managed it in 2002. Now, at that time, Wembley was under reconstruction, so the non-league finals were played at Villa Park. And I think what kind of marks this out in my life is it was quite a tough time for me, actually. I was living in London at the time, and I was working as a journalist, and it was pretty cutthroat. It was pretty hard.
I can imagine it. It seems like it might be a competitive industry in London.
Definitely. So I went and did something a bit more sedate for a few years after that. But, I suppose my solace was, it was near enough that I could pop up to Stevenage for pretty much every home game. I remember my uncles telling me, as Staines Town fans, how they had once been to all but 2 of an entire season of Staines Town games. So this is the nearest I got to that. So Stevenage went from the FA Trophy third round in January all the way to the final, and I went to every game. So it's my misspent youth, And I think, there are a couple of guys now who do go to every single game, and the people that have been to every game this season, I think, deserve
I will buy anybody who has been to every Stevenage game this season. I will buy you a beer, because you need one.
Absolutely, yeah. So sure, I'll let them know.
Let them know.
Yeah, it's only a couple of pints. I think.
And so you're talking home and away.
Yeah, that's right. So in this case, with the FA Trophy back then, it was a bit easier than that, because we were drawn at home in every round, and that took us through actually some interesting games. The the strange thing about playing at that level of non-league is that obviously if it's the FA Cup third round, fourth round, you're the minnow and you're playing the giant. But in the FA Trophy, the boot can be on the other foot, you know? So one of the games we played was against Bashley. Now, Bashley is a village, basically. The population of the village can fit inside the stadium about 5 times over, right? I think about 20% of the village were in the away stand at Stevenage that day. So they gave us a bit of a scare, actually, but we came through that game. We played Forest Green in the next round, 1-3-2. And what I remember about that game was we had, all the different weathers you can imagine. So at one point, snow started to fall. They got out the yellow ball. Then the snow got quite heavy, so they got out the orange ball.
You know, I was going to say, that had to be one of the few times when popular opinion was in the favor of Stevenage when you guys played Forest Green. That was like the one day in history that everybody was Stevenage.
Well, I'll tell you what, actually, because obviously Forest Green, they're a bit weird now, aren't they? They've got this big investor and want to build a wooden stadium now. Wooden stadium is not a bad idea per se. There's a team in the Hungarian league, Puskás Akadémia, which has a really spectacular wooden stadium. But actually, in those days, the investor hadn't come in yet. Forest Green had got to that level on their own, and they still played in black and white stripes.
Quite yet there.
Exactly. So it's a bit premature. But, the orange ball used to be a real kind of feature of football. But these days, games get called off when the first snowflake falls. So the specific game I remember going to was the first leg of the semi-final. We went up to Morecambe, and I have to say Morecambe is a brilliant club. I mean, I know this year we were kind of hoping to send them down, but they're
not a brilliant club. We hate Morecambe.
Oh, okay. But I always found the fans.
We hate Morecambe more than we hate Stevenage.
But no, I found the fans up there were great. Actually, I know that there's a statue on the seafront of Morecambe of Eric Morecambe, the famous late comedian, and he had a Stevenage shirt put over him that day. But so it was a brilliant atmosphere. We took 2 coach loads, which for a non-league semi-final is really not bad at all. And that was just the first time I'd ever really been on a long away trip, and it was really, really good. Phil Wallace, who'd taken over by that time, came onto the bus afterwards to thank us all for our support. And it was just a really good occasion as a fan. And as I say, when we finally got to the final at Villa Park, it was a slight disappointment because a lot of people turned up who, wished us well, but at the end of the day were neutrals or slightly, inclined to support Stevenage. And it was just, compared to the most sort of passionate occasions we have, it was, there's a bit of an anticlimax, really. We lost that game 2-0. One of the scorers, the man of the match in that game, was Adam Stansfield, who he went on to play for Exeter as well and sadly passed away a few years later. And Carl Alford, by that time, had hauled his bulk from Stevenage to Yeovil Town. And, as former players always do, he scored the other goal against us. But it was a great experience. And, our time would come later when we did actually finally win the FA Trophy.
Yeah, and then I think that'll be a good place for us to pick up next week. I mean, we've kind of talked right now about from the 90s through 2002. So next week we'll just kind of pick up with 2002, and we'll just kind of make this like a 2-part over 2 weeks episode, because this is great stuff. I'm really I enjoyed your stories and just hearing, how each season, just kind of like you said, from your perspective of, what was going on, and then using each game to, kind of be a capsule of that season. And I have a feeling that we're going to talk about 2007, 2009, and 2011 for sure next week.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, of course, you know what they always say about semi-finals is that the losing team is forgotten. So when you said Accrington 2011, I kind of had to rack my brains about that, because that year I'm only thinking of the final,
You beat a good rival of yours in the next game, so I'm sure that probably has something to do with you remembering that one too. I won't spoil who that was, but I know it was somebody that you mentioned that there was a little bit of heatedness about earlier.
Yeah, it was funny though. I mean, I mentioned that at the time, but most people seemed to have moved on. So I guess other people are less bitter than I am. I don't know.
Well, we'll visit that next week, because we don't want to give away our big spoiler. So next week we will be like the newspaper, and people are going to have to wait until next week to find out who you beat in the 2011 final. And Jonny, as always, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to doing this again next week.
Very happy to, and make sure you tune in for the Belarus episodes as well.
Yeah, and in this one, I need to just throw in for Matt. Right now, we have Energetic within 1 point of Bate, and we now have Bayern Munich 7 points ahead of Dortmund. So I'm going to need to get an Energetic shirt, I think, or just root for Dortmund to keep losing or something. You know what I'm talking about.
I do. All right. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.